My name is Stella, I'm 38, and for most of my life, my own father used our family's Thanksgiving dinner as a stage to publicly humiliate me. Every single year. Before I tell you about the moment I revealed a single, devastating secret that shattered his perfect family image forever, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Thanksgiving at our house always came with a script. No one ever admitted it, but it was obvious. The golden turkey, the matching linen napkins my mother fussed over for weeks, the playlist of carefully curated jazz humming in the background. Even the laughter felt rehearsed, like we were all playing out the same scene from a family drama we couldn't admit we were tired of. Every year, we gathered around that polished mahogany table like nothing was broken. And every year, my father, with the timing of a seasoned performer, would find a way to turn the spotlight toward my sister, Carrera. The crown jewel. The golden girl. He'd raise a glass, his voice booming with a practiced charm. To Carrera, he'd announce, "Your sister just closed on a gorgeous new home. 4 bedrooms, a porch, like something out of a movie. She's always been ahead of the curve." And then, without fail, his eyes would drift to me, a performative smirk playing on his lips. "When will you catch up, Stella?" The laugh track would kick in right on cue. My uncles, aunts, cousins, they'd chuckle, shaking their heads as if Dad was just being classic Dad. Harmless teasing. But I wasn't laughing. I never laughed. I smiled. I stayed still. I played my part. That was my role. Stella, the helper. The one who arrived early to set the table, who brought the good wine, who folded the extra chairs and asked if there were enough desserts. I was the one who got questions like, "Still doing that job thing?" or "Did you ever finish that certification program?" The questions weren't malicious, but they weren't real either. They were placeholders, small talk that politely skipped over the parts of my life that didn't fit their narrative. My real life. Carrera, though, she got engagement toasts, job promotions, and stories of Paris vacations. Sharp as a tack, Dad would say, proudly clinking his glass to hers. "Our little powerhouse," Mom would add, beaming. And Carrera would blush just enough to seem humble, like she wasn't soaking it all up like sunlight. I used to tell myself I didn't mind. That I was grounded, humble, that staying under the radar made me strong. But inside, I was crumbling. Quietly. Invisibly. Every laugh that followed those jokes carved another line into my spirit, another whisper that said, "You'll never be her." It started so early I can barely remember a time before it. When I was 10, I won a statewide art contest. My painting, a watercolor of the woods behind our house, was going to be displayed at the state capitol. I was bursting with pride. That night at dinner, Dad clinked his fork against his glass. My heart leaped. But he didn't look at me. He looked at Carrera. "I just want everyone to know," he announced, "that Carrera got a trophy for perfect attendance this year. Not a single day missed. That's dedication." He brought it up 3 more times that night. No one asked to see my painting. It was as if it didn't exist. When I was 16, I passed my driving test on the first try. I was so excited to finally have some freedom. Carrera had failed hers twice. And still, I was the one Dad teased. Stella only passed because the instructor was too bored to keep testing her, he joked to anyone who would listen. The family would laugh, and Carrera would offer a sympathetic little shrug, as if to say, "What can you do?" It became a pattern. Praise for her, ribbing for me. And somehow, I let it become the truth. I'd sit in silence while Carrera told stories about corporate wins and home renovations, waiting for someone, anyone, to ask me what I was building. No one did. Because I wasn't loud about it, they assumed I wasn't anything. The last Thanksgiving I attended before everything changed was the worst. Carrera had just gotten a big promotion. Her husband, Trevor, had a high salary, and they were the picture of success. Dad made a toast that went on for 10 minutes, detailing every single one of Carrera's achievements since birth. He ended, as always, by turning to me. "And Stella's here, too," he said, like an afterthought. The table offered a few polite smiles in my direction before turning back to Carrera. I felt a hot flash crawl up my neck. I just stared at my plate, the fork heavy in my hand. That was it. That was the last straw. The next year, I didn't go home. I lied, of course. Told Mom I had a work deadline I couldn't miss. She accepted it without question. It was always easier for her to believe a simple lie than to confront a complicated truth. I remember her calling me a week before the holiday. "Oh, honey, that's too bad," she'd said, her voice already distant. "Well, we'll miss you. I'll tell everyone you're busy with work." There was no follow-up question. No, "Are you okay?" No, "Is everything all right?" Just a quick, clean acceptance. It hurt, but it also confirmed everything I already knew. That Thanksgiving, I sat alone in my small apartment, eating Thai takeout on my coffee table, fuzzy socks on my feet. The muted glow of a Hallmark movie played in the background, full of happy fictional families laughing around fictional tables. I waited to feel sad. I waited to feel left out, to feel the sting of loneliness. Instead, I felt still. That silence, it felt like oxygen. No one asking when I'd catch up. No one measuring me against Carrera. No one treating me like a misfired version of someone else's success. In that stillness, I heard a different voice, my own. And it didn't whisper failure. It whispered, "Now what?" That question became my mission. I started small. I took the freelance marketing contracts everyone said were a dead end. I stacked them, client by client, slowly turning patchwork gigs into a reliable income. I didn't have a business degree. I didn't have a mentor. So I became my own. I stayed up until 3 in the morning watching tutorials on SEO, learning how to write business proposals, how to handle my own taxes. I taught myself contract law from library books and online forums, terrified of making a mistake that would sink me. The first 6 months were brutal. There were times I was so broke I lived on ramen and coffee, staring at my bank account, my blood running cold with fear. I nearly lost my biggest client because of a rookie mistake in a pitch deck. I remember sitting on my floor at 2 a.m., surrounded by crumpled paper, my body shaking with exhaustion and panic. I wanted to quit. I wanted to call my parents and admit I was a failure, just like they always expected. But then I thought of that Thanksgiving table, of my father's smirk, and a cold resolve washed over me. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. I stayed up all night, rebuilt the entire strategy from scratch, and sent it at 6 a.m. The client called me a few hours later. They were blown away. They signed a year-long retainer. That was the first real crack of dawn. After that, things started to shift. I built a reputation for being relentless, for delivering results. By the end of the second year, I had 6 clients on retainer. I wasn't just freelancing anymore, I was running my own consultancy. I was financially independent. No loans, no help. I was building my own future, my own inheritance, brick by painful brick. Just past the 2-year mark, I moved out of my cramped walk-up apartment. And a few months after that, I signed the papers on a house. Not a condo, not a fixer-upper. A real house, just over 4,000 square feet of peace and privacy. There was no fanfare. No curated Instagram post, no just closed selfies with a giant key. Just me, my lawyer, and the quiet scratch of a pen on paper. It wasn't secrecy. It was sacred. Every time I crossed a milestone, I wondered, just for a second, what Dad would say if he knew. Would he be proud? Would he take credit, call it inevitable, like it had all been part of some long game he'd predicted? But the phone never rang. He never asked. Not once did he or my mother call just to check in. They assumed I was drifting, that I was lost. Because to them, visibility meant value. If they couldn't see it, it didn't count. If it didn't look like Carrara's life, it wasn't worth noticing. That used to burn, deep and corrosive. But lately, it just made things clearer. I had been climbing my own mountain all this time. Just because they were all staring at a different peak didn't mean mine wasn't real. So when the Thanksgiving invite came again this year, I hovered over the RSVP button, my thumb shaking. I almost declined. But then I thought about that dinner table, that script, that polished set where I'd always played the background role. And I decided I was done shrinking. I didn't need their applause. But I refused to be erased. So, I clicked yes. And when I walked through that door, wearing confidence like a second skin, I didn't do it to rub anything in their faces. I did it to reclaim my space. To take back the air that had always been mine to breathe. The house looked the same. Of course, it did. Mom's perfect table setting, Dad's carved turkey routine, the ambient jazz. Carrara's laugh flowed like a well-rehearsed melody. But I was different. I walked in with a bottle of Pinot Noir and a steady heart. My cousin Abby caught my eye from across the room and gave me a warm, genuine smile. "You look amazing, Stella," she whispered as I slid into my seat at the far end of the table. I smiled back. It was a small thing, but it felt like the first real acknowledgement I'd had in that house in years. Dinner unfolded in its usual rhythm. Platters passed. Polite conversation. Dad's jokes filled the air. Trevor, Carrara's husband, chuckled too loudly, too often. Mom buzzed around the table like a hostess with something to prove. I kept quiet, calm. I watched the way everyone floated in orbit around Carrara, like she was the center of some unspoken system we'd all agreed on decades ago. But inside me, a truth sat steady and solid. I didn't belong in that orbit. Not anymore. Then came dessert, pecan pie, Dad's favorite. And right on cue, he set down his fork, dabbed at his mouth with a napkin, and raised his voice just enough to command the room. "Well, your sister has some big news," he boomed. Carrara just closed on a gorgeous new home. 4 bedrooms, granite countertops, a wraparound porch, everything. "Oh, wow." Aunt Carol gushed. "She's just always ahead of the curve," Trevor's mom cooed. Dad chuckled, his chest puffed with pride. And then he turned his eyes to me. The spotlight swung in my direction. "Stella, when are you going to catch up, huh?" There it was. The moment. The line. Every head turned toward me. Some curious, some amused. Even Carrara tilted her head, an expectant look on her face, waiting for my usual brush-off. But I didn't flinch. I didn't stutter or shrink. I looked my father directly in the eye and I smiled. Not a bitter smile, not a smug one. Just steady. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it down with a soft click. "I did," I said, my voice perfectly even. Silence. Not a dramatic, explosive silence, but a sharp one, like a pinprick in the skin of a balloon. Carrara's fork paused midair. Trevor blinked. Aunt Carol tilted her head, confused. Mom froze, mid-pour of sparkling cider. Dad blinked. "You did?" I nodded. "About a year ago." "A year?" Mom echoed, her voice thin. "Why didn't you say anything?" "I guess it never came up," I said. That answer, soft but true, landed like a quiet verdict. No anger, no drama. Just a mirror. And I let them sit in it. I let them feel what it was like to not already know my story. Dad gave a short, tight laugh, the kind he used when control was slipping from his grasp. "Well," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "That's cryptic." "It's not," I said, my tone calm. "You asked." I answered. He glanced around the table, trying to read the room, to reclaim his unspoken authority. "So, what, you bought a house?" he asked, his voice dipped in doubt. "I have," I replied. "Paid in full." That did it. The air in the room didn't just shift, it cracked. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. It was a deep, fundamental confusion. Recalibration. Aunt Carol let out a soft, "Oh." Trevor blinked again. Carrara's posture straightened, becoming defensive. Dad gave a brittle laugh. "That's a lot of space for someone on their own." "Maybe," I said, reaching for a dinner roll. "But like I said, no mortgage. So it's not really a burden." Still no anger. Just truth. The silence wasn't awkward. It was adjusting, like the room was slowly catching up to a reality they hadn't even considered. And I let them. I didn't rush to soften it. I didn't pat it with self-deprecation. They had spent so long scripting who I was. Now they had to face the unscripted version. Dad didn't know what to do with the silence. He fumbled for a tone, humor, disbelief, maybe even praise, but none of them landed. I watched as his smile flickered, then faded altogether. Carrara was the first to speak. "Of course, she was." "That's great, Stella," she said, with the kind of syrupy sweetness that tried to sound supportive but landed hollow. "Buying a house is a big deal. You didn't want to share that with your family?" I met her gaze directly. "You mean the family that only ever asks how close I am to being like you?" Her expression cracked, just slightly. A flicker in her eyes, a tightening of her jaw. "I didn't hide it out of spite," I continued. "I just didn't feel the need to explain myself anymore." Dad leaned forward, trying to pull the conversation back into something he could steer. "So what kind of work are you doing now? I thought you were still freelancing." "I was. Now I run my own consultancy. 6 clients under retainer." Mom blinked. 6? I nodded. "Financially independent. No loans, no help." Dad sat back in his chair like he'd been hit with a gust of wind. "Well," he said, latching onto the one thing he could, "Carrara's neighborhood is fantastic. Great schools, a great long-term investment." "Totally," I said, my voice light. "Although, technically, it's not her name on the deed." The table fell dead still. Carrara's mouth parted. "Excuse me?" I kept my tone neutral, matter of fact. "It's just what the records show." Trevor signed the mortgage. "It's public info, you know. Registry of Deeds. You don't even need a lawyer to look it up." I let that hang in the air. Trevor flushed a deep, blotchy red, looking like he'd rather disappear into his mashed potatoes. "We're married," he mumbled. "It's our house." "Of course," I replied smoothly. "But we both know how banks work." Carrara's voice sharpened. "Why would you even look that up?" "I didn't," I said. "A friend in real estate sent it to me months ago. Said it was funny how I was always the one being compared when I was the only one not owing a bank anything." Dad raised a hand. Okay, this is getting out of hand." "No," I said quietly. "It's finally honest." And that's when I saw it. That flicker in Dad's eyes. Not anger, not pride. Doubt. For the first time, he didn't know who the golden child at the table really was. Carrara crossed her arms, her voice tight with fury. "I never asked to be compared." "Neither did I," I nodded. "But it happened anyway. Every holiday, every birthday, every time someone looked through me to get to you." The table was silent. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. "I'm not attacking," I said. "I'm just done pretending." I reached for my glass and took a slow sip. I built something real. I just didn't need an audience to clap for me along the way. No one moved. Carrera looked like she was holding her breath. Trevor's face was frozen, his fork untouched. Mom dabbed at the corner of her eye with a napkin, her lips trembling. And Dad. Dad looked older than I remembered. Not physically, just smaller, like a man who had built his entire worldview on a foundation that had just cracked beneath his feet. Carrera's voice came back, low and brittle. For someone who didn't want attention, you sure timed this pretty perfectly. I tilted my head. I didn't time anything. You asked when I'd catch up. I simply answered. Trevor shifted uncomfortably beside her. Let's not make this a competition. It's always been a competition, I said gently. Just one I wasn't told I was in. That hit the table like thunder. Even Mom glanced at Carrera, really glanced at her, with uncertainty behind her eyes. I kept going, my voice steady. I worked 12-hour days for 3 years. No vacations, no backup plan. I stayed up until 2 in the morning designing pitch decks and learning SEO. I taught myself contracts. I built everything from scratch. I looked around the table. No one asked. Not once. Aunt Carol, to her credit, blinked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. You skipped 2 Thanksgivings, she murmured. I nodded. And no one called. No one checked in. You just assumed I was floundering, that I was still the one behind. Carrera scoffed. So what do you want, applause? A parade for doing your job? No, I said, my voice dangerously soft. I wanted a family that didn't measure my worth by how closely I mirrored your life. She looked stunned, like I had spoken in a language she didn't know existed. I never claimed to be better, I added. But you all made it very clear I was somehow less. And I believed it, until I realized your standards had nothing to do with me. The table didn't move. No one blinked. No one reached for their wine. You praised what you could measure, I continued. Square footage, job titles, curated photos. But not resilience. Not risk. Not doing the hard things in silence. Dad finally spoke, his voice low. Why didn't you just tell us? I turned to him. Because it wouldn't have mattered. You already decided who I was a long time ago. You put me in a box labeled still trying and never looked inside. He inhaled sharply. That's not fair. It's not about fairness, I said. It's about a pattern. Then I turned to Carrera. You're not the villain. But you've never once used your voice to shift the spotlight. You stood in it because it was handed to you, and you never asked why it was so one-sided. She stared at me, guilt flickering in her eyes. Or maybe it was something deeper. Recognition. I didn't know, she said quietly. You didn't ask, I replied. And you never wondered why I stopped showing up. Mom's eyes welled up, her napkin trembling in her fingers. Stella. I didn't realize, she said, her voice cracking. I know, I replied, not with spite, but with a deep, weary exhaustion. That's the problem. The silence that followed wasn't confrontational. It was recognition. The sharp, undeniable kind. Everyone at that table was suddenly aware of something they had refused to acknowledge for decades. I had grown. I had arrived. And they hadn't seen a thing. I folded my napkin and placed it on the table. Then I stood. The movement was smooth, deliberate. My heart wasn't racing. I wasn't walking out in a rage. I was walking out because the chapter had finally, blessedly, ended. Mom stood up slightly. Stella, wait. I met her gaze with something softer than she expected. You always wanted me to come home, I said gently. But you never once asked if I was okay. You just wanted updates you could brag about, not the truth of who I was becoming. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I turned to Carrera next. We don't have to be close. But it would have meant something if, just once, you'd pulled me aside and asked how I was doing. Really doing. No filters, no followers. Just sister to sister. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. No defense left. Just silence. Finally, I turned to Dad, the man whose approval I had once chased like oxygen. You built a world where success looked one way. Where love had conditions. I didn't fit, so you didn't see me. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Stella. I don't need an apology, I said. I just needed the truth to be heard. As I walked towards the door, a strange thing happened. My cousin Abby, who had been silent the whole time, looked directly at my father. Well, she said, her voice quiet but clear. She did answer your question, Uncle. It was a small stone tossed into a still pond, but the ripples were immediate. A crack in the facade. I slipped on my coat and grabbed my purse. No tears, no outburst. Just clarity. Peace. The door clicked shut behind me. The cold November air rushed in, stinging my skin in the most refreshing way. Not one person called after me. And for the first time in my life, that silence didn't feel like rejection. It felt like release. The walk to my car was slow and silent. I slid into the driver's seat and let the engine hum to life, watching my breath fog the window. I could still see the outline of the house in my rearview mirror. Warm lights, a perfect family. The show went on without me, and that was okay. For so many years, I thought leaving meant failure. But as I sat there, I realized I hadn't walked out to escape them. I had walked out because I had finally found myself, and I wasn't willing to leave her behind to keep playing a part in their script. I remembered something my grandfather once told me when I was 13, sitting on his porch while everyone else took family photos I wasn't invited to. He leaned over, handed me a mug of hot cocoa, and said, "You don't have to shine in their light, Stella. You just have to stop forgetting you have your own." That voice echoed in me now, strong and clear. I had spent so long trying to be understood. Now I just needed to be true. A few months passed. The holidays came and went in a quiet blur. I didn't hear from my parents or Carrera. But I did get a text from Abby. "Thinking of you. So proud of everything you've built." It was a small bridge, but it was real. I poured my energy into my work, but also into myself. I started a blog, a space to write about my experiences. The first post was titled, "You're Not Behind. You're just not where they expected you to be." It was terrifying to put myself out there, but the response was overwhelming. Women from all over the country shared their own stories of feeling invisible, of being measured by someone else's ruler. I realized my story wasn't just mine. Last week, I gave my first public talk at a women's leadership conference. The topic was building your own table. As I stood on that stage, looking out at a sea of faces, I felt a sense of peace I'd never known. I wasn't the forgotten sister anymore. I was a woman who had built her life, quietly, completely, and without compromise. I don't know if my family will ever truly understand. Maybe they'll sit around the table next Thanksgiving and notice the empty chair. Maybe they'll remember what was said, not because it was loud, but because it was real. Or maybe they won't. Either way, I'm free. No more apologizing, no more shrinking, no more waiting to be seen in a house built to overlook me. Because I wasn't behind. I had already arrived. And I wasn't going back. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Have you ever been made to feel like the afterthought at your own family table? Like your quiet success didn't count because it didn't come with applause? Share your story in the comments, I'll be reading. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick around for more stories of resilience, truth, and quiet power. You're not behind. You're just not where they expected you to be. And that's your power.